Story number 1.
It was the winter of 2014 when Eric began his late-night shifts at a gas station just outside of a rural Michigan town. He had recently moved back home after a failed attempt to make it in Detroit and needed the work. The station sat on the edge of a state forest, surrounded by dense trees and a two-lane road that saw barely any traffic after midnight. Eric's first impression of the station was how dated it looked. The flickering neon sign buzzed loudly, the linoleum floors were cracked, and the aisles were crammed with dusty snacks and expired cans of soup. The station's owner, an elderly man named Carl, rarely updated anything, preferring to let the place limp along as it always had. The nights were long, and Eric often found himself alone for hours, his only company the occasional trucker or a bored cop from the nearby town. But it was quiet, and that suited him just fine. Or at least it did, until the night things started to change. It was a little after 2 a.m. on a Thursday, and Eric was leaning on the counter, scrolling through his phone. The store was silent except for the faint hum of the overhead lights. Outside, the forest loomed, black and endless. He glanced at the security monitor, a grainy black and white screen mounted above the register. The parking lot was empty. As he turned back to his phone, he thought he saw something move on the monitor. A shadow darting across the edge of the screen. He frowned and looked up again, but the lot was still. Shrugging it off as his imagination, he went back to his phone. A few minutes later, the automatic doors slid open with a hiss. Eric's head snapped up. No car had pulled in, and no one had walked up to the door. Yet it stood wide open, letting in a rush of icy air. "Hello?" he called out, his voice echoing in the empty store. No answer. He stepped out from behind the counter and peered outside. The parking lot was deserted, the only sound the rustling of the wind through the trees. He walked over to the doors and waved his hand in front of the sensor, testing it. They slid shut without issue. Weird, he thought, but not impossible. It could have been a glitch in the sensor. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The rest of the night passed uneventfully, but the incident stayed in the back of his mind. Over the next few shifts, more strange things began to happen. Shelves would fall over for no reason, scattering items across the floor. The radio behind the counter would flicker on and off, spitting out static even when it wasn't plugged in. And then there were the footsteps. Eric first heard them on a quiet Tuesday night. He was mopping the floor near the coolers when he heard the unmistakable sound of boots on tile. They were slow and deliberate, coming from one of the aisles. He froze, gripping the mop handle tightly. "Who's there?" he called out. The footsteps stopped. Eric edged toward the aisle, peeking around the corner. It was empty. The rows of snacks and drinks sat undisturbed, the fluorescent lights casting long shadows. "Hello?" he called again. He called, his voice trembling slightly. Nothing. He walked up and down the aisles, checking every corner of the store, but there was no one there. When he returned to the counter, he glanced at the security monitor. The footage showed him walking through the aisles, but the sound of footsteps continued, even when he wasn't moving. That was the night Eric started to feel afraid. The final straw came 2 weeks later. It was just after 3 a.m., and the store had been dead quiet for hours. Eric was restocking cigarettes behind the counter when the phone rang. Startled, he picked it up. "Hello?" For a moment, there was nothing but static. Then, faintly, he heard a voice. "Get out." Eric's blood ran cold. The voice was distorted, low and guttural, like it was coming from far away. "Who is this?" he demanded, his voice shaking. The static grew louder, drowning out the voice. Then the line went dead. Eric slammed the phone down, his heart racing. He tried to convince himself it was a prank, but deep down, he knew it wasn't. He looked around the store, every shadow suddenly seeming darker, every creak of the building louder. He decided to check the security cameras again. As he rewound the footage, his stomach dropped. The screen showed something that shouldn't have been there. In the far corner of the store, by the coolers, was a figure. It was tall and hunched, its body cloaked in shadow. It didn't move, just stood there, staring directly at the camera. Eric whipped his head toward the coolers, but they were empty. He looked back at the screen, and the figure was gone. Panic set in. Eric grabbed his keys and bolted for the door, not caring about the shift or the register. As he stepped outside, he thought he heard laughter, faint, high-pitched, and echoing in the cold night air. He didn't stop running until he reached his car. Eric quit the next day. When Carl asked why, Eric just said he couldn't handle the night shifts anymore. He didn't tell him about the figure or the voice on the phone. He didn't tell anyone. Years later, Eric heard the gas station had burned down. The official story was an electrical fire, but some locals whispered that it was something else, something that had been haunting the place for years. Eric never went back to find out. He avoided that stretch of road whenever he could, but sometimes, late at night, he'd remember the figure on the camera and the voice on the phone, and he'd wonder if whatever was in that gas station had followed him, or if it was still out there waiting for someone else. Story the end.
Story number 2.
The highway stretched endlessly through the countryside, its narrow lanes illuminated only by the faint glow of distant stars and the occasional headlights of passing vehicles. On this lonely stretch of road, nestled between thick patches of woods and barren fields, stood a small gas station. It wasn't much to look at, just a flickering neon sign that read, "Open 24/7, a single pump, and a dimly lit convenience store." It was the kind of place most people sped past without a second thought, unless they were desperate for fuel or a bathroom break. It was 2008, and Eric had just started working the night shift there. He wasn't thrilled about the job, but it paid better than anything else he could find in the area. The station was quiet at night, with only the occasional trucker or late-night traveler stopping by. It gave Eric plenty of time to catch up on books, listen to music, or scroll through his ancient flip phone. That night, the air was unusually still, the kind of silence that seemed unnatural. Even the insects, which normally created a constant background hum, were quiet. Eric leaned back in his chair, glancing at the clock on the wall. 12:45 a.m., only a few more hours to go. The first sign that something was off came at exactly 1 a.m. Eric was flipping through an old magazine when the automatic door opened with a soft chime. He looked up, expecting to see a customer, but the store was empty. He frowned, got up from his chair, and walked to the door, peering out into the parking lot. Nothing. The gas station was surrounded by darkness, with only the pale glow of the overhead lights breaking through the gloom. The highway was empty, no headlights in sight. He shrugged it off and went back inside, chalking it up to a malfunction. A few minutes later, the door chimed again. This time, Eric stayed seated, his eyes fixed on the entrance. The door slid open and then shut again, as if someone invisible had walked in. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. "Hello?" he called out, his voice echoing in the empty store. There was no answer, just silence. Eric walked around the counter, his heart pounding, and checked the aisles. They were empty. He even stepped outside, scanning the parking lot again. Still nothing. He rubbed his arms, suddenly feeling a chill despite the warm summer night. When he returned to his seat, he noticed something strange. A pack of gum that had been sitting on the counter was now on the floor, several feet away. Eric stared at it, trying to remember if it had been there earlier. He told himself he must have knocked it off without realizing it and bent down to pick it up. As he straightened, the overhead lights flickered. Once, twice, and then went out completely, plunging the station into darkness. Eric froze, his breath catching in his throat. The only light now came from the faint green glow of the security monitor behind the counter. "Damn it," he muttered, fumbling for the flashlight he kept in the drawer. He clicked it on, the beam cutting through the darkness. He was about to check the breaker box when something on the monitor caught his eye. On the grainy black and white screen, the gas pump came into view. A car was parked there, an old, beat-up sedan. Eric's stomach tightened. He hadn't heard it pull in, and it definitely wasn't there when he had checked the lot earlier. Squinting at the screen, he saw a figure step out of the car. It was a man, tall and thin, wearing a dark coat and a hat that obscured his face. He walked slowly toward the store, his movements stiff and unnatural, like a marionette being dragged along by invisible strings. The automatic door chimed again, and Eric spun around, aiming his flashlight at the entrance. No one was there. He turned back to the monitor. The man was now standing inside the store, directly in front of the counter. Eric's heart raced as he whipped the flashlight around, but the beam revealed nothing. "Hello?" Eric called out, his voice shaking. "Is someone there?" No answer. He was alone, or so it seemed. The store felt colder now, the air heavy and oppressive. Eric reached for the phone to call his manager, but the line was dead. He cursed under his breath, glancing back at the monitor. The man was still there, unmoving, his face a blur of static. Eric decided he wasn't going to sit there and wait for something to happen. He grabbed the baseball bat he kept behind the counter for emergencies and marched toward the door. He stepped outside, his flashlight sweeping across the lot. The sedan was gone. "Okay, this isn't funny," he muttered, his voice louder now. "If someone's messing with me, you better stop." The only response was the rustling of leaves in the distance. Eric stood there for a moment, his grip on the bat tightening before retreating back inside. As soon as he stepped through the door, the lights flickered back on. The hum of the refrigerator returned, and the store felt normal again. Almost. Eric tried to convince himself it was just his imagination. Maybe he was tired. Maybe the security system had glitched. But when he looked at the counter, his blood ran cold. There was a single black and white photograph sitting there, one he had never seen before. The picture showed the gas station, but it was older, probably decades ago. The pump was a different model. The sign above the store read something else, and the parking lot was surrounded by overgrown weeds. In the corner of the photo, near the pump, stood a tall man in a dark coat and hat. Eric stared at the photo, his hands trembling. The man in the picture was the same one he had seen on the monitor. He flipped the photo over, hoping for some clue, and found a date scrawled in faded ink, September 3rd, 1983. A sudden pounding noise made him jump, and he dropped the photo. It was coming from the back of the store, near the stockroom. Eric hesitated, every instinct telling him to leave, but something compelled him to move forward. He raised the bat, his flashlight shaking in his other hand, and pushed open the stockroom door. The room was empty, but the pounding continued. It was coming from the back wall, where the shelves of supplies were stacked. Slowly Eric approached, his breath shallow. The pounding grew louder, more insistent, as if something or someone was trying to break through. "Who's there?" Eric shouted. "I'm armed. Don't mess with me." The pounding stopped abruptly, replaced by an eerie silence. Eric stood frozen, the bat raised, waiting for something to happen. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw movement. A shadow slipped past the doorway, heading back into the main store. Eric spun around and ran back out, but the store was empty again. The photo was gone, vanished as if it had never been there. His heart pounded as he backed toward the counter, trying to make sense of what was happening. Then the lights flickered one last time and went out completely. Eric stood in the pitch-black store, gripping the bat so tightly his knuckles turned white. He could feel it now. He wasn't alone. A cold breath brushed against the back of his neck, and he turned sharply, swinging the bat. It hit nothing but air. The store filled with whispers, faint and unintelligible, coming from all around him. The flashlight flickered and died, plunging him into total darkness. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The lights came back on, the whispers ceased, and the store was quiet. The clock on the wall read 3 a.m. Eric didn't move, his body frozen in place. He stayed like that until his replacement arrived at 6 a.m. Eric quit the next day. He didn't bother explaining why. He packed up and moved out of town, leaving the gas station and whatever haunted it behind. A few years later, he heard the place had been shut down after several other employees experienced similar events. He never went back, but every now and then when he drove late at night, he'd catch a glimpse of an old beat-up sedan in his rearview mirror. And every time, it was gone the moment he blinked. Story the end.
Story number 3.
In 2013, Alex took a job at a gas station off Highway 17, a quiet, almost forgotten road that connected two small towns in rural Tennessee. The station was old and isolated, surrounded by miles of dense woods and farmland. Most of the daytime customers were truckers and farmers passing through. But the night shift, that was something else entirely. Alex worked from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. alone, with only the hum of the fluorescent lights and the occasional late-night traveler for company. The first few weeks were uneventful. Alex would stock shelves, clean the store, and pass the time scrolling through his phone. The only sounds were the buzzing of the overhead lights and the occasional car pulling up to the pump. He didn't mind the solitude. In fact, he liked it, until one night when things started to feel off. It was a Wednesday, just past midnight. A storm had rolled in and rain lashed against the windows, the wind howling like a living thing. The store was empty, and Alex was behind the counter, flipping through a magazine he'd found under the counter. The automatic door chimed, and he looked up, expecting to see a customer. No one was there. The door had slid open on its own, letting in a gust of cold, wet air. Alex frowned and walked over to the door, peering out into the rain-soaked parking lot. It was empty. Not a single car in sight. He stepped outside, the rain instantly soaking through his hoodie, and looked around. The highway was quiet, and the only movement came from the swaying trees on the edge of the lot. "Hello?" he called out, his voice barely audible over the storm. There was no response. Shaking his head, Alex went back inside and wiped his face with a paper towel. He figured the wind must have triggered the sensor. He returned to the counter, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling creeping up his spine. The rest of the night was quiet, but Alex couldn't shake the sense that he wasn't alone. Every so often, he'd catch movement out of the corner of his eye, a shadow passing by the windows or a flicker of light in the far corner of the store. He told himself it was just his imagination. After all, it was late, and he was tired. The following night, things got stranger. Around 2 a.m., Alex was restocking the cooler when he heard a soft knock. It was faint, almost like someone tapping on glass. He froze, the hairs on his arms standing up. The knock came again, louder this time, echoing through the empty store. Slowly, Alex turned toward the sound. It was coming from the large glass window near the entrance. But when he looked, there was nothing there, just the rain streaming down the glass and the dim glow of the parking lot lights. He walked cautiously to the window, his heart pounding in his chest. He pressed his face to the glass, trying to see beyond the rain and darkness. For a moment, he thought he saw a figure standing at the edge of the lot, just beyond the reach of the lights. It was tall, motionless, and shrouded in shadow. But when he blinked, it was gone. Alex backed away from the window, his pulse racing. He decided to check the security cameras. Behind the counter, a small monitor displayed grainy black and white footage of the store and the parking lot. He rewound the tape to the moment he'd heard the knock. On the screen, he saw the window, the rain, and, just for a split second, a figure standing there, staring into the store. Its face was obscured, but its posture was unnatural, like it didn't belong. The figure disappeared as quickly as it had appeared. Alex sat back in his chair, his mind racing. He considered calling his boss or even the police, but what would he say? That he saw something weird on the cameras? He decided to stay put and ride out the rest of his shift, though he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. A few nights later, Alex was sweeping the floor when the lights flickered. They dimmed for a moment, plunging the store into near darkness before coming back on. He muttered a curse under his breath, assuming it was the storm messing with the power. But then he noticed something strange. One of the aisles, the one with the snacks, was in disarray. Bags of chips and candy bars were scattered across the floor, even though he'd just cleaned it earlier. He walked over, broom in hand, and started picking up the mess. As he did, he heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps coming from behind him. Alex spun around, expecting to see a customer. The store was empty. "Hello?" He called out, his voice echoing in the silence. "Is someone there?" No answer. He stood there, broom clutched tightly in his hands, listening. The footsteps had stopped, but the air felt heavier, like something unseen was pressing down on him. He backed away, his eyes darting around the store, and returned to the counter. The rest of the shift was uneventful, but Alex couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. When his shift ended, he left the store without looking back. The next night, Alex decided to talk to his coworker, Sam, who worked the morning shift. Sam was in his 40s, a laid-back guy who'd been at the station for years. "Hey, Sam," Alex said, trying to sound casual. "You ever notice anything weird around here at night?" Sam gave him a long look before setting down his coffee. "Weird how?" "Like, the door opening on its own, stuff moving around, footsteps." Sam sighed and leaned back in his chair. "You're not the first person to say that," he said. "This place has always been strange. I've heard stories from other people who worked here, things going missing, voices, shadows. Some folks say the place is haunted." "Haunted?" Alex asked, his stomach tightening. Yeah, there was an accident here years ago, back in the 80s. A car ran off the highway and slammed into the pumps. The driver didn't make it. People say he still hangs around. Alex felt a chill run down his spine. He wanted to laugh it off, but deep down, he couldn't. The things he'd seen and heard were too real to ignore. That night, Alex went back to work, determined to get through his shift without letting his imagination run wild. But as the hours dragged on, the strange occurrences continued. The door chimed without opening. The lights flickered. And once, when Alex looked up at the monitor, he saw a figure standing by the pumps. It was blurry and indistinct, but it was there. He didn't go outside. Instead, he stayed behind the counter, his eyes glued to the monitor, waiting for the figure to reappear. It didn't. At 3:15 a.m., the store fell silent. The hum of the refrigerators stopped, the lights dimmed, and the air grew cold. Alex felt a presence behind him, something heavy and dark. He turned slowly, his breath catching in his throat. There, standing at the entrance to the store, was the figure. It was tall and thin, its face pale and gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to pierce through him. It didn't move, it just stood there, watching him. Alex froze, his mind screaming at him to run, but his legs wouldn't move. The figure took a step forward, its footsteps echoing through the store. Then another step, and another. Finally, Alex found his voice. "What do you want?" he shouted, his voice cracking. The figure stopped. For a moment, it seemed to waver, as if it were made of smoke. Then it vanished, leaving Alex alone in the store. When his shift ended, Alex left without looking back. He never returned to the gas station. He quit the next day, leaving a voicemail for his boss that he didn't even bother to explain. He packed his things and moved to a different town, far away from Highway 17. To this day, Alex doesn't know what he saw or why it haunted the gas station, but sometimes, late at night, he dreams of hollow eyes watching him through the rain.
Story number 4.
The gas station sat on the edge of town, the last stop before a desolate stretch of highway that ran straight through the wilderness. It wasn't much. A single pump, a convenience store with shelves half-stocked, and a dimly lit parking lot that seemed more inviting to stray cats than people. The place had been there for decades, changing ownership several times, but never shaking the eerie feeling that clung to it like oil stains on concrete. In 2014, Megan started working the night shift there. She was 22, fresh out of college with no direction and bills piling up. The pay wasn't great, but the job was easy enough. Most nights, she spent her shift scrolling through her phone or sipping on lukewarm coffee from the ancient machine in the corner. Occasionally, a trucker would stop in for gas or a pack of smokes, but for the most part, it was just her and the hum of the refrigerators. The first night, Megan noticed something strange. She chalked it up to fatigue. It was nearing 2 a.m., and the store was dead quiet. She was restocking the fridge with soda cans when she heard the chime of the door. Startled, she looked up and saw no one. The door had opened, but the parking lot outside was empty. She stepped out from behind the counter and peered through the glass. "Hello?" she called out. Her voice echoed in the stillness. No answer. She walked outside, the cool night air biting at her skin, and scanned the lot. There was no car, no sign of anyone. Megan shrugged it off, figuring it was a glitch in the sensor, and went back inside. The rest of her shift passed without incident, but the uneasy feeling lingered. Over the next few nights, small, unexplainable things began to happen. Shelves she had organized would be in disarray when she turned her back. Items would fall to the floor with no one near them. The door would chime, but the store would remain empty. She told herself it was nothing. A draft, old equipment, her imagination, but deep down she felt like she was being watched. One night, around 3 a.m., Megan was behind the counter, scrolling through her phone when the lights flickered. They dimmed for a moment, casting long shadows across the store, then returned to normal. She frowned and glanced at the security monitor. The screen was grainy, but she could make out the pump in the parking lot. That's when she saw it. A figure standing near the edge of the lot just beyond the range of the lights. It was hard to make out any details, but it was tall, motionless, and facing the store. Megan's stomach tightened. She leaned closer to the monitor, trying to get a better look, but the figure was gone. She spun around and looked out the window. Nothing. The lot was empty. She grabbed the flashlight from under the counter and stepped outside, her heart pounding in her chest. The beam of light swept across the cracked pavement, revealing only empty space and the faint outline of the woods beyond. "Is someone out here?" she called, her voice trembling. Silence. Megan stood there for a moment, listening to the night, before retreating inside and locking the door behind her. She spent the rest of her shift on edge, her eyes constantly flicking to the monitor. The next morning, she told her coworker Ryan about what she'd seen. He was in his late 30s with a weathered face and a laid-back demeanor. He'd been working at the station for years. "Yeah, that happens sometimes," he said nonchalantly, sipping his coffee. "What happens?" Megan asked, confused. "Stuff like that. Weird stuff. It's an old place, probably just the wind or bad wiring." He paused, then added, "But if you see anything, really strange, just leave it alone." Megan stared at him, unsure if he was joking. "What do you mean?" Ryan shrugged. "Just saying, sometimes it's better not to mess with things you don't understand." That night, Megan's shift started as usual. She tried to shake off Ryan's cryptic comment, but it lingered in the back of her mind. Around midnight, the door chime sounded again. This time, a man entered the store. He was tall and thin, with a gaunt face and hollow eyes that seemed to sink into his skull. His clothes were old-fashioned, like something out of the 1970s. A plaid shirt tucked into faded jeans, with boots that looked scuffed and worn. He moved slowly, his footsteps eerily quiet, as he wandered the aisles. "Good evening," Megan said, forcing a smile. The man didn't respond. He didn't even look at her. He just moved methodically, picking up a can of soup, a box of crackers, and a bottle of water. He placed the items on the counter and stared at her, unblinking. "That'll be $7.85, she said, her voice wavering. The man reached into his pocket and pulled out a handful of coins, old coins, tarnished and unfamiliar. He placed them on the counter without a word. Megan hesitated. I don't think I can accept these. Do you have anything else?" The man tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. Then, without a word, he turned and walked out of the store, leaving the items and the coins behind. Megan watched him leave, her pulse racing. When she looked out the window, she expected to see a car, but the lot was empty. She grabbed the coins, intending to show Ryan the next morning, but when she looked at her hand, they were gone. Her palm was empty. From that night on, the strange occurrences escalated. The door would open and close on its own. Lights would flicker, and the security monitor would show fleeting glimpses of shadows that disappeared the moment she turned around. Megan began to dread her shifts, but she couldn't afford to quit. One particularly quiet night, she decided to dig a little deeper. She searched the back room for old records or anything that might explain the gas station's strange history. Tucked away in a dusty box, she found a faded newspaper clipping from 1975. The headline read, "Local man dies in gas station fire." The article described a tragic accident in which a man had been trapped inside the station when a fire broke out. His name was James Harper, and the photo included with the article made Megan's blood run cold. It was the man she'd seen in the store. She slammed the box shut and left it where she found it. That night, as she sat behind the counter, she felt an overwhelming sense of dread. The air grew colder, and the hum of the refrigerators seemed to fade away. Then she heard it, a faint tapping sound coming from the glass door. Megan looked up and saw him. James Harper. He was standing outside, his face pale and expressionless, his hollow eyes locked on hers. She froze, unable to move or even scream. Slowly, he raised a hand and pointed at her, his finger trembling. The lights flickered violently and the tapping grew louder, more insistent. Megan grabbed her keys and bolted, not bothering to lock up. She didn't stop running until she reached her car. When she looked back at the station, the lights were off and the lot was empty. Harper was gone. She quit the next day, leaving the gas station and its haunted past behind. Years later, she heard the station had been torn down. A new convenience store was built in its place, but Megan never went back. Sometimes, late at night, she'd hear the faint chime of a door in her dreams, and it always brought her back to that lonely gas station and the man with the hollow eyes. Story the end.
Story number 5.
The gas station stood alone on a stretch of highway surrounded by miles of forest on either side. It was the kind of place you only stopped at out of necessity, not convenience. The single pump was rusted and creaky, the fluorescent light over the canopy flickered sporadically, and the store itself had a faint smell of stale coffee and burnt grease. Tom had been working the night shift at the station for 3 months. He hated it, but it was the only job he could get after moving to this small town in 2009. He spent most nights sitting behind the counter, scrolling through his phone or reading whatever paperback novel he had brought with him. The rare customers who came through were usually truckers or locals, their faces tired and impatient. It was nearing 1 a.m. when the first odd thing happened. Tom was refilling the coffee machine when he heard the faint sound of a car engine. Looking out through the smudged glass door, he saw an old sedan pull up to the pump. The car was ancient, its paint chipped and peeling, and its headlights barely illuminated the cracked pavement. Tom stepped outside, expecting the driver to roll down the window or step out to pay, but the car just sat there, engine idling. He squinted, trying to see through the tinted windows, but they were too dark. Uneasy, he knocked lightly on the driver's window. No response. "Hey, you need some help?" he called out, his voice shaky. The engine cut off and the car went completely silent. Tom took a step back. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the driver's side door creaked open and a man stepped out. The man was tall and gaunt, his clothes outdated like something out of the early 1980s. He wore a brown suit that hung loosely off his frame and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face. When he finally looked up, Tom's stomach dropped. The man's eyes were black, not just the irises, but the entire sclera, like polished obsidian. "Is the station open?" the man asked, his voice soft and gravelly. "Yeah," Tom stammered, stepping aside to let him in. The man's presence felt wrong, like he didn't belong in this world. As the man walked past, Tom noticed that his shoes didn't make any sound on the floor. The man wandered through the aisles, his movements slow and deliberate. He picked up random items, a can of soup, a pack of batteries, a box of crackers, and placed them on the counter. Tom scanned the items quickly, eager for the transaction to end. "That'll be $12.50, Tom said, forcing a smile. The man reached into his pocket and pulled out a wad of cash. As he handed over the bills, Tom's hand brushed against the man's and an icy chill shot up his arm. It was like touching something that had been buried in snow for hours. "Thank you," the man said, tipping his hat. He turned and walked out without another word, leaving Tom with a sense of unease that lingered long after the man and his car disappeared into the night. The rest of the shift passed without incident, but Tom couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The next night, he returned to work, hoping for an uneventful shift. But around the same time, 1 a.m., the old sedan pulled up again. Tom's heart sank as he watched the same gaunt man step out of the car. This time, the man didn't go into the store. Instead, he stood by the pump, staring at Tom through the glass door. Tom tried to ignore him, focusing on the crossword puzzle in front of him. But he could feel the man's gaze, heavy and unrelenting. Finally, he couldn't take it anymore. He grabbed the phone and dialed the local sheriff's office. "Sheriff's office, this is Deputy Harris," a tired voice answered. "Hi, this is Tom over at the gas station on Route 17. There's this guy here, and he's just standing outside. He was here last night too, and something about him doesn't feel right." "We'll send someone over to check it out," Harris replied. "Stay inside and lock the doors." Tom hung up and looked back toward the pump. The man was gone. His car was still there, but the man had vanished. Tom felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. He locked the door and turned off the lights inside, hoping to make it look like the station was closed. About 10 minutes later, a patrol car pulled into the lot. Deputy Harris stepped out, a flashlight in hand. Tom unlocked the door and stepped outside to meet him. "He was right there," Tom said, pointing to the pump. "But now he's gone." Harris nodded and walked over to the car. He shone his flashlight through the windows, but the car was empty. He tried the door handle. It was unlocked. "What the hell?" Harris muttered, pulling the door open. The interior of the car was pristine, like it had just rolled off the assembly line, despite its battered exterior. There were no personal items, no registration, nothing to indicate who the owner might be. Harris turned back to Tom. "You're sure you saw someone?" "Positive," Tom said. "He came in last night too, paid in cash." Harris nodded again, his face grim. "I'll have the car towed. If you see him again, call us." The tow truck arrived about 30 minutes later and the car was hauled away. Tom felt a small sense of relief, thinking the ordeal was over, but deep down, he knew it wasn't. The following night, Tom hesitated before going to work. He thought about calling in sick, but decided against it. Bills had to be paid, and he couldn't afford to lose the job. He arrived at the station just before midnight, his nerves on edge. The hours ticked by slowly, and for a while it seemed like it would be a normal shift. But at exactly 1 a.m., the lights inside the station flickered. The air grew colder, and Tom could see his breath forming in front of him. Then he heard it, a faint tapping sound coming from the front door. He turned, his heart pounding. The gaunt man was back, but this time he wasn't alone. Behind him stood a group of figures, all dressed in old, tattered clothing. Their faces were pale, their eyes as black as the man's. The man raised a hand and pointed at Tom. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. Tom backed away, his mind racing. He grabbed his phone and dialed 911, but the line was dead. The lights flickered again, and then everything went dark. Tom's flashlight was the only source of illumination as he stumbled toward the back room, desperate to find something, anything, to defend himself. The tapping stopped. The silence that followed was oppressive, like the air had been sucked out of the room. Then, from the darkness, a voice whispered, "Leave." It was the man's voice, but it sounded distorted, like it was coming from underwater. The word echoed in Tom's head, making him feel dizzy and disoriented. The next thing he knew, he was outside, standing in the middle of the parking lot. The station was dark, its windows shattered. The figures were gone, and so was the man. Tom quit his job the next day. He never went back to the station, and whenever he drove past it on the highway, he made sure to keep his eyes on the road, and afraid of what he might see if he looked. A few months later, the station burned down. The fire was ruled an accident, but Tom wasn't so sure. He heard rumors from locals about other strange occurrences at the station over the years. Disappearances, unexplained accidents, and sightings of the gaunt man. Tom moved to a different town and tried to put the experience behind him. But sometimes late at night, he would wake up to the sound of tapping on his window. And every time, he was too afraid to look.
Story number 6.
It was 2008 when Lisa, a college dropout trying to make ends meet, took a graveyard shift at a gas station just outside of a small Ohio town. The station, a relic of the 1970s, sat at a desolate crossroad flanked by empty fields and a dense patch of woods. Locals called it Luther's Stop after the original owner, but the place had been sold years ago. Now it was just another worn-out convenience store, with its buzzing fluorescent lights, a single functioning gas pump, and a faint smell of oil and stale coffee. Lisa didn't mind the quiet shifts. It was easy money for little effort, mostly cleaning, ringing up the occasional trucker, and killing time with a tattered paperback she kept stashed under the counter. The isolation didn't bother her either. The nearest house was a mile away, and there was something peaceful about the silence of the fields stretching endlessly into the dark. But that peace didn't last long. On her third week, Lisa noticed something strange. It was just past 1 a.m., and she was wiping down the coffee counter when she heard the faint sound of footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, like someone pacing outside. She glanced out the window, but the parking lot was empty. The only thing she could see was the dim glow of the station's neon sign reflecting off the wet pavement. Brushing it off as her imagination, she returned to her task. But then, the footsteps came again, closer this time. Lisa froze, the hairs on her arms standing on end. She turned back to the window, half expecting to see someone standing there. Nothing. Just the empty lot and the black void of the fields beyond. Grabbing the flashlight from under the counter, she stepped outside, her breath fogging in the chilly night air. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling slightly. The beam of light swept across the lot, illuminating the pump, the edge of the woods, and the dumpsters at the back. There was no one there. The footsteps stopped after that, but the unease lingered. Lisa locked the doors and spent the rest of her shift glancing nervously at the security monitors. The grainy black and white footage showed nothing unusual, just the empty aisles and the parking lot outside. The next few nights were quiet, and Lisa started to convince herself that she'd just been jumpy. But a week later, things took a darker turn. It was a Friday night and the roads were especially quiet. Around 2 a.m., Lisa was restocking the cooler when she heard the chime of the front door. She peeked out, expecting to see a customer, but the store was empty. The door was shut and the parking lot outside was still. Frowning, Lisa walked over to the counter and checked the security footage. Her stomach dropped. The tape showed the door sliding open on its own, like pausing for a moment, then closing. There was no one there. She rewound the footage and played it again, leaning closer to the screen. This time, she noticed something she hadn't before. Just as the door closed, a shadow flickered across the far end of the lot, so faint it could have been a trick of the light. But it sent a chill down her spine. Lisa decided not to investigate. She stayed behind the counter, trying to focus on her book, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Every so often she'd glance at the window, half expecting to see someone standing there. The parking lot remained empty, but the sense of unease grew heavier with each passing hour. A few nights later, Lisa's coworker Ben, who worked the day shift, mentioned something strange. "You ever hear about what happened here?" he asked casually as they traded shifts. "No." "What do you mean?" Lisa replied, curious but wary. Ben leaned against the counter, lowering his voice. "Back in the 90s, there was a guy who used to work here. Real quiet type. One night, someone found him dead out in the lot. They said it was a heart attack, but some folks think he saw something that scared him so bad, his heart just gave out." Lisa laughed nervously. "And you're telling me this now?" Ben shrugged. "Figured you'd hear it eventually. Locals still talk about it sometimes. Say his spirit never left." Lisa rolled her eyes, but the story stuck with her. That night, as she worked her shift, she couldn't stop thinking about the man who had died there. She wondered if it was true or just a ghost story meant to scare new employees. Around 3 a.m., the lights flickered. It wasn't unusual for the station to have electrical issues, so Lisa didn't think much of it. But then the flickering stopped, and the lights dimmed to a strange, sickly yellow. The hum of the refrigerators grew louder, almost deafening, and the air felt heavy, like it was pressing down on her chest. Lisa stood frozen behind the counter, her eyes darting around the store. The atmosphere had shifted, and she felt an overwhelming sense of dread. Then she heard it, a faint, raspy whisper coming from the far end of the store. "Lisa?" Her heart nearly stopped. She hadn't imagined it. Someone had said her name, but there was no one there. She grabbed the flashlight and slowly made her way toward the sound, her hands trembling. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice barely above a whisper. The whisper came again, louder this time. "Lisa." It was coming from the aisle with the snacks. She turned the corner, shining the flashlight down the aisle. For a moment, she thought she saw a figure standing there, a tall, shadowy shape at the far end, but when she blinked, it was gone. Lisa backed away, her pulse racing. She ran to the counter and grabbed the phone to call Ben, but the line was dead. She fumbled for her cell phone, only to find that it had no signal. Suddenly, the security monitor caught her attention. The screen showed the parking lot, and there, standing by the pump, was a figure. It was blurry and indistinct, but it was unmistakably a person. They weren't moving, just standing there, staring directly at the store. Lisa's breath hitched as she stared at the screen, willing the figure to move or disappear, but it didn't. Gathering her courage, she grabbed the flashlight and stepped outside, determined to confront whoever or whatever it was. The figure was gone. The parking lot was empty, just as it had been every other time, but the air felt colder and the night was unnaturally silent. Lisa hurried back inside and locked the doors, vowing to quit the next morning. Her final shift was her most terrifying. Around 4 a.m., she heard the footsteps again, this time accompanied by the faint sound of laughter. It was high-pitched and childlike, echoing through the empty store. The lights flickered, and the refrigerators hummed louder than ever. Then the door chime sounded, and the lights went out completely. Lisa was plunged into darkness, her only light the faint glow of the emergency exit sign. She grabbed her flashlight and pointed it toward the door. There, standing just inside the entrance, was a man. He was pale and gaunt, his eyes sunken and his clothes disheveled. He didn't move, didn't say a word. He just stared at her, his head tilting slightly to one side. Lisa backed away, her hands trembling so badly she almost dropped the flashlight. "Who are you?" "What do you want?" she demanded, her voice cracking. The man didn't respond. Instead, he slowly raised one hand and pointed toward the back room. Then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, he was gone. The lights flickered back on and the store was empty. Lisa didn't wait to find out what would happen next. She grabbed her bag and ran out the door, not even bothering to clock out. She never went back to the gas station and refused to drive past it, even during the day. Years later, she learned the station had been shut down and demolished after a fire. No one ever figured out what caused it, but Lisa wasn't surprised. Whatever haunted that place was gone, and she hoped it stayed that way. Story the end.
Story number 7.
It was the summer of 2012 when Tony took a part-time job at a gas station off a lonely stretch of highway in western Nebraska. He had just graduated high school and was saving for college, so the late-night shifts didn't bother him. The gas station was old and isolated, a single-story building with flickering neon lights and a solitary pump. Behind it stretched endless fields, and in front lay the highway, which seemed to disappear into the horizon. Tony liked the quiet. On most nights, the only people who stopped by were long-haul truckers or the occasional family on a road trip. He spent the downtime scrolling through his phone, reading old comic books, or listening to music on the tinny store radio. But the solitude also made the station feel eerie, especially after midnight when the world outside seemed to shrink into darkness. The first time Tony noticed something unusual was on a Thursday night. Just after 2 a.m., he was restocking the cooler when he heard the distinct ding of the front door chime. Setting down a crate of soda bottles, he glanced toward the counter, expecting to see a customer. The store was empty. "Hello?" he called out, stepping out from the cooler. The parking lot outside was deserted, and the only sound was the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. He checked the security monitors, rewinding the footage. The door had opened on its own. No one had entered and no cars were parked outside. Tony frowned, chalking it up to the wind or a faulty sensor, and went back to work. But the door wasn't the only thing. Over the next few nights, strange things began happening. The coffee machine would turn on by itself, gurgling and steaming even though no one had touched it. The overhead lights would flicker, plunging the store into brief moments of darkness. And sometimes in those moments, Tony felt like he wasn't alone. He couldn't explain it, just a prickling sensation on the back of his neck, like someone was standing behind him. One night, as he was sweeping the floor, Tony noticed something odd on the security footage. A car had pulled up to the pump about 15 minutes earlier, a beat-up sedan with its headlights on, but no one ever got out. The car just sat there, idling. He stepped outside, but by the time he reached the lot, the car was gone. There were no tire marks on the pavement, no sound of an engine fading into the distance. It was as if it had vanished into thin air. When he mentioned it to his coworker Jill, she shrugged it off. "This place is old," she said. "Weird stuff happens sometimes. You'll get used to it." But Tony wasn't so sure. A week later, he was alone on the late shift when things escalated. It was around 3 a.m., the quietest time of the night. Tony was sitting behind the counter, scrolling through his phone, when the power suddenly went out. The hum of the lights stopped, plunging the station into silence. The only light came from the moon outside, casting pale beams through the large front windows. "Great," he muttered, grabbing a flashlight from beneath the counter. He made his way to the breaker box in the back room, his footsteps echoing in the empty store. The air felt colder back there, and the tiny hairs on his arms stood on end. As he reached for the breaker, he heard it, a faint rhythmic tapping. It sounded like fingernails drumming against glass. His heart raced as he turned, shining the flashlight toward the sound. It was coming from the front of the store, near the windows. "Probably a bird," he whispered to himself, trying to stay calm. But as he walked back to the front, the tapping grew louder. When he reached the counter, he froze. There, pressed against the glass, was the outline of a hand. It was faint, almost like a smudge, but unmistakable, and it wasn't moving. "Who's out there?" Tony called out, his voice shaking. He stepped closer to the window, shining the flashlight into the darkness outside. The parking lot was empty, and the fields beyond were silent. But when he looked back at the glass, the handprint was gone. Tony backed away, his breath quickening. He locked the front door and stayed behind the counter for the rest of his shift, jumping at every little sound. When the morning came, he left as quickly as he could. The following night, Tony didn't want to go back to work, but he couldn't afford to quit. He tried to convince himself that he'd imagined it, that the stress of working alone was playing tricks on him. But as the hours dragged on, the uneasy feeling returned. Around 2:30 a.m., Tony was restocking shelves when he heard a noise coming from the bathroom. It sounded like the sink running. He frowned, grabbing his flashlight, and walked over to the restroom door. The station's bathrooms were small and cramped, rarely used by anyone but employees. He pushed the door open slowly, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The faucet was on, water gushing into the sink. Tony stepped forward to turn it off, but as he did, he noticed something in the mirror. A figure, tall and shadowy, standing just behind him. He spun around, the flashlight beam sweeping the small bathroom. It was empty. His chest heaved as he tried to calm down, gripping the edge of the sink to steady himself. But when he looked back at the mirror, the figure was still there, watching him. Tony bolted out of the bathroom, slamming the door shut behind him. He didn't care about finishing his shift. He grabbed his car keys and ran for the exit. As he reached the door, the lights in the store flickered back on, and he heard it again, that rhythmic tapping on the glass. This time, he didn't look back. He drove straight home, not stopping until he was safely inside his apartment. He called Jill the next morning and told her he wasn't coming back. He didn't give her a reason, and she didn't ask. Years later, Tony heard that the gas station had been abandoned. The owner had gone bankrupt, and the building was left to decay. Locals said it was haunted, that strange things had happened there for decades. Some even claimed the land itself was cursed, a remnant of something that had happened long before the station was built. Tony never went back to find out. He avoided that stretch of highway whenever he could, but sometimes, late at night, he'd think about the shadow in the mirror and the handprint on the glass, and he'd wonder what would have happened if he hadn't run.